A story where an eerie teapot's haunted past didn't just plunge an old family into darkness, but buried a terrifying secret deep within the search for a greater truth. As Miss Marple set her sharp mind to unraveling the puzzle, she uncovered a world darker than anyone could have imagined, one manipulated by the greed and fear of those who would stop at nothing. Today you'll discover how a simple mistake and the desperate search for redemption altered the course of a life forever. Are you ready to uncover the lies and the hidden truths? Then stay with us, because this tale will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very end. It was a warm and tranquil afternoon in St. Mary, the kind of day that made even the busiest souls slow their pace. Miss Marple comfortably nestled in her rose garden, sipped her tea, and observed the late-blooming flowers with quiet satisfaction. The bees hummed lazily in the lavender, and the air was filled with the delicate scent of autumn's arrival. She had just finished reading the parish newsletter, and was smiling to herself, reflecting on Mrs. Featherstone's enthusiastic yet misguided campaign to have the church bell retuned. "A bit too sharp for the ear, my dear," Mrs. Featherstone had said, and Miss Marple found amusement in the way she could stir up such fervor over something so minor. But as she sat there, a fleeting thought crossed her mind, as light as the autumn breeze, a thought about how delightful it was when things remained as they should, simple and unchanged. However, Miss Marple, with her years of quiet observation and acute understanding of human nature, knew well that beneath even the most peaceful surfaces, something else often lurked. Despite the peace of the afternoon, there was always an undercurrent of unease, a subtle sense that things were never quite as calm as they appeared. The next morning, as the vicar's boy delivered the post with a grin and the unmistakable sound of muddy boots, Miss Marple found amongst the usual letters one in a shaky, spidery handwriting that immediately caught her attention. Her eyes narrowed as she recognized the sender, Beatrice Langford. They had known each other for years, from charity committees to long-winded debates at the Women's Institute about marmalade versus jam. Beatrice had always been a bit dramatic, but she was clever and well-meaning, never one to be taken lightly. Miss Marple unfolded the letter and read it carefully, then read it again for good measure. The words were written with a sense of urgency that was palpable. "My dear Jane, I know how this must sound, and perhaps you'll think me silly, but there is something in this house, something old and very wrong. It centers around a teapot of all things, a teapot I should never have kept. There have been strange accidents, and now I fear there may be worse to come. Would you come to Elderflower Lodge, just for a few days? I do not quite trust those around me. Yours in distress, Beatrice." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, noticing a faint tea stain on the corner, her brow furrowing. A teapot, she mused to herself. How curious to fear something so simple. Despite the oddity of the request, she felt a peculiar sense of unease settle in her chest. Something about the letter didn't sit right with her, and her years of experience told her that Beatrice's distress was not born from imagination. By the following afternoon, Miss Marple was winding her way through the quiet lanes of Chipping CLE, in a hired motor car, her eyes taking in the pale countryside obscured by a drifting fog. The trees stood stark against the dull sky, their branches reaching like black lace. After what seemed an eternity, Elderflower Lodge finally came into view. It was an imposing, ivy-clad estate that had clearly seen better days, its grandeur now marred by time and neglect. The driver pulled up to the front entrance, and Miss Marple stepped out, her umbrella in hand. She was greeted not by Beatrice, but by a housemaid with red-rimmed eyes and a nervous tremor in her voice. "Mrs. Langford is resting," the girl said quietly, opening the door to a dimly lit hall. "She's been most upset these days." As Miss Marple stepped inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. The faint scent of lavender polish and old books lingered in the air, but there was a heaviness to the atmosphere, as if the very walls were listening. She was led to a modest guest room, and left alone to unpack. As she did so, she noticed something strange. Outside her door, the corridor was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt too still, too watchful. It was a feeling that prickled the back of her neck. She thought again of Beatrice's letter, and the strange fear it had conveyed. What was so frightening about a teapot? Could there truly be something sinister hidden in something so ordinary? Later that evening, Beatrice emerged from her room for supper, looking pale and drawn but still managing to retain a trace of her old elegance. She grasped Miss Marple's hand and whispered, "Thank you, Jane. I feel safer already." But the quiet gratitude in her voice did little to ease the tension in Miss Marple's mind. As dinner was served in a large wood-paneled room that had witnessed many family gatherings, and just as many unspoken tensions, Miss Marple observed the others around the table with quiet scrutiny. Nigel Langford, Beatrice's nephew, was dressed in a smart suit, but kept fidgeting with his fingers nervously. His wife Clara barely touched her food, her eyes constantly avoiding contact with anyone. Dr. Felix Moley, Beatrice's personal physician, exuded a confident charm, though it seemed rehearsed and not entirely sincere. And then there was Charles Merton, the local historian, who seemed more interested in the antiques lining the walls than the people around the table. Polite conversation drifted around the table, but underneath it, a sense of tension simmered, thick and palpable. Miss Marple said little, but her sharp eyes were everywhere, taking in the smallest details. She noticed how Nigel flinched when Beatrice spoke, how Clara dropped her fork at the mention of the old cabinet in the corner, and how Dr. Moley smiled too quickly at nothing at all. There was something they were all hiding, something that lurked beneath the surface of their calm exteriors. Miss Marple couldn't yet put her finger on it, but one thing was clear: a mystery was unfolding in this house, and the key to it, strangely enough, seemed to be that innocuous teapot. Miss Marple had long since realized that every family harbors its secrets, though some hid them better than others. The Langford family, she thought, had too many, far more than most. As the dinner conversation ebbed and flowed, Beatrice suddenly interjected, her voice a tightrope of tension, her fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over her glass. "None of you have touched the teapot, have you?" she demanded, her words falling over the table like a heavy curtain. A silence swept through the room, and Dr. Moley let out a soft, amused chuckle. "Now, Beatrice, you can't seriously believe all that nonsense, can you?" But Beatrice's eyes were wide, locked on the object she seemed to fear most. "It's not nonsense," she insisted, her voice quivering as she lifted her wineglass, the tremor in her fingers betraying the calm she was trying to project. "That teapot is cursed. Mrs. Delaney used it once, and she died 2 weeks later." Colonel Havisham fell down the stairs after his second cup. There was a ripple of discomfort at the table, though none dared to speak further. It was Charles Merton, the local historian, who leaned in with too much eagerness, as if he relished the mystery. "It's 18th century porcelain, Mandarin pattern, Qing dynasty possibly," he mused, his voice dipping into a tone of fascination. "The legends surrounding it are, well, quite intriguing." Miss Marple, ever the observer, sipped her soup thoughtfully, her mind churning. "Objects rarely carry malice, my dear. It's people who do that," she murmured, her words drifting into the silence that followed. "Laugh all you like," Beatrice said sharply, her gaze sweeping over the table, daring anyone to contradict her. "I've locked it away in the cabinet. It is not to be touched." No one responded, but Miss Marple noticed it then, the flicker in Nigel's eyes. It wasn't fear, but irritation, as though something he had planned had suddenly gone awry. Superstition, Miss Marple knew, was often a smokescreen for something far more human. The next morning broke damp and grey, the fog curling along the hedgerows like the remnants of a forgotten dream. Miss Marple was awakened not by the maid's knock, but by raised voices and hurried footsteps outside her door. She dressed quickly and stepped into the hallway, just as Clara Langford rushed past, her face streaked with tears, and her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Martha, the maid, stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale and stricken. "It's Mrs. Langford," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's gone, ma'am." Miss Marple entered the bedroom with quiet deliberation. Beatrice lay on the bed, her eyes closed, her face serene, as if she had simply drifted into a deep, peaceful slumber. The doctor was already there, and Nigel stood in the corner, arms tightly folded, his eyes avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was not the body. It was the teapot. There it was, placed neatly on the nightstand, the very one Beatrice had forbidden anyone to touch. Its porcelain surface gleamed faintly in the soft light of the morning, and though untouched, it radiated a quiet menace. "How did this get here?" Miss Marple asked softly, her voice barely a whisper, though the question hung heavily in the room. No one answered. The silence was thick, suffocating, and in that silence the mystery was born, not of a death, but of how fear, superstition, and something far colder had seeped into the room during the night. The official explanation delivered with confident ease by Dr. Moley was that Beatrice had died in her sleep from heart failure. A peaceful passing, really and not altogether unexpected, given her frail health. Miss Marple listened as always, offering her polite attentiveness, nodding occasionally, murmuring her sympathy to the others. But in the back of her mind, a quiet disturbance stirred. Beatrice had not seemed like a woman expecting to die. No, there had been a sharpness to her the evening before, a nervous energy that burned beneath her words. She had not been resigned, but rather she had seemed troubled, on edge. More unsettling still was the presence of the teapot. Dr. Moley made no mention of it, and neither did anyone else, yet there it sat, on the nightstand, as if placed there deliberately. Miss Marple recalled Beatrice's own words over supper. "It's locked away, no one is to touch it." And yet here it was, in plain sight, with no explanation. The cabinet in which it had been stored remained locked, with no sign of forced entry. There was no key to be found, and no one seemed to know how it had come to be there. Perhaps Beatrice changed her mind, Nigel had suggested with a shrug, but his voice lacked conviction. Too convenient, Miss Marple thought. The timing of Beatrice's death, the sudden appearance of the teapot, and the overall calmness of the situation, it all felt far too calculated. She had learned over the years that some mysteries were not born from the unexpected, but rather from the things that had been carefully arranged, waiting for their moment. And this moment was far from over. The afternoon wore on, the air heavy with a lingering chill, as the estate's future was decided. The announcement that it would pass entirely into the hands of Nigel Langford arrived with little surprise. The solicitor had already been expected, his paperwork ready for swift processing. Nigel, however, wore his composure like a carefully crafted mask, offering his thanks to those who offered their condolences with a practiced, almost mechanical grace. His hands clasped, his smile too tight, his eyes betraying the tightness around his jaw. He was not a man who appeared to grieve. He was too collected, his emotions locked behind a carefully constructed barrier. Miss Marple, sitting nearby with her embroidery in hand, watched him carefully, noticing the small, nearly imperceptible signs of discomfort. The man did not weep, nor did he express anything other than a superficial sorrow, a far cry from the more genuine unease that others, like Charles Merton, displayed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she observed him, noting how his glances darted to the drawing-room door whenever someone entered, as though waiting for something or someone to arrive. His lack of reaction unsettled her further, especially in light of Beatrice's letter, which spoke of danger rather than illness. She had been full of life just a few days ago, and now suddenly, she was gone. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the oddness of it all, the eerie calm that seemed to settle over the room like a shroud. The teapot, which had been so carefully locked away, was now a silent witness to the unfolding mystery. It had sat, untouched but ominously present, on the nightstand beside Beatrice's bed, its gleaming porcelain surface, an unsettling reminder of the death that had come too conveniently, too easily. No one knew how it had appeared there. No key had been found, no sign of forced entry into the locked cabinet, where it had once been hidden. Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, turning over the puzzle pieces in her mind. Clara Langford, her pale face and soft-spoken demeanor, seemed so fragile, so easily overlooked, but Miss Marple could sense something more beneath her quiet exterior. In the conservatory, Clara had looked up in surprise when Miss Marple entered, as though she were expecting someone else. The words she spoke, so frail and fearful, confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Beatrice had been frightened, convinced that someone meant her harm. But who? The question gnawed at Miss Marple's mind as she left Clara to her thoughts. Seeking out Dr. Felix Moley later that afternoon, he greeted her in his usual brisk manner. Too fast, too eager, as though he were trying to hide something. His explanation of Beatrice's sudden death was neat, tidy, and almost too convenient. Heart failure. Something not unexpected in someone with her medical history. But Miss Marple's mind refused to let it go. There was something more at play here. Something hidden beneath the surface. And it wasn't just the teapot. Dr. Moley had prescribed digitalis for her. A mild dosage, he claimed. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. Something about the way he said it, too casual, too rehearsed, made her wonder if he truly knew everything, or if there were darker secrets buried deeper still. Dr. Moley's hesitation was brief, but it didn't escape Miss Marple's sharp attention. His usual calm seemed to falter for just a fraction of a second, the smoothness of his response slightly strained. Yes, well, as far as I know, she managed her prescriptions herself. Quite independent, really. His words trailed off, and Miss Marple could sense the discomfort in his tone, even if he quickly masked it with a smooth, practiced smile. Independent, especially when it came to things that frightened her, Miss Marple remarked softly, her words carrying the weight of unspoken truths. For just a moment Dr. Moley's expression faltered, his smile stiffening, before he quickly regained his composure. You mustn't let her fears trouble you, Miss Marple, he said with a lightness that was almost too casual. Old houses, old stories. People often imagine things that aren't really there. Miss Marple didn't contradict him, but the brief flicker in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He had expertly avoided speaking about who else might have had access to Beatrice's medicine, deflecting attention with a carefully chosen remark. She made a mental note of his reaction, understanding that he had steered the conversation away from something he wished to remain unexamined. Martha Pike had served the Langfords faithfully for over 2 decades, a woman who was usually as solid as the house itself. Yet in the days since Beatrice's death, something had shifted. Martha's once unshakable demeanor had splintered. Her eyes were always darting nervously, and she had begun to jump at the slightest sound. Miss Marple found her in the linen room, folding sheets with a mechanical, almost robotic care, the rhythmic motion of her hands betraying a mind much more agitated than she let on. Martha, my dear, Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft as a whisper in the dimly lit room. You look as though you haven't slept a wink. Martha hesitated, then gave a small shaky laugh, her eyes flicking nervously to the door. I suppose I haven't, ma'am. She offered the words almost apologetically, as if she knew she should be able to handle things better. Something troubling you? Miss Marple pressed, her voice compassionate but firm. There was a long pause before Martha glanced around the room, her voice lowering to a near whisper. I heard someone walking down the corridor that night, just after midnight. Not Mrs. Langford though. She never leaves her room at night. I always brought her tea in the mornings, and her curtain was always still drawn. The uncertainty in Martha's voice was palpable, her hands fumbling as though she were trying to hold on to something stable, but failing. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Did you see who it was, Martha? She asked, her voice steady, guiding the maid to speak more openly. Martha's hands stilled for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Just the sound, she said, her eyes wide with fear. Soft steps. Not heavy like a man's, but not light either. Strange really. I couldn't tell who it was. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, allowing the silence to settle between them. Finally, with a gentle smile, she offered, You need not fear the truth, Martha. But I understand, sometimes, fear of people can be greater than fear of legends. Martha nodded, but she said nothing more, her eyes glancing anxiously toward Clara Langford's room as she made her exit. Miss Marple's mind raced as she watched Martha leave, the words she had left unsaid echoing in her mind. She couldn't ignore the way Martha had avoided mentioning exactly what it was that had frightened her. The shadows, the sounds, and more importantly, why was she looking toward Clara's room with such anxiety? Later that evening, Charles Merton appeared, his ever-present pipe clutched in one hand, a restless energy radiating from him. He roamed the study with a purposeful pace, his eyes scanning the room with a detached interest that made it clear he was not concerned with the family's mourning, but rather with something far more personal. He lingered by the display cabinet, his gaze lingering on the infamous teapot that Beatrice had always kept locked away. Miss Marple, ever observant, saw this and addressed him in her usual gentle manner. "You seem drawn to that cabinet, Mr. Merton," she said, her tone light, but with an underlying curiosity. He chuckled, the sound smooth but lacking warmth, as though he were trying too hard to appear at ease. "Habit," he explained with a shrug. "I'm an antiquarian by nature. It's a bit of a disease, really." His eyes, however, never left the teapot, a piece of porcelain so much more than it appeared. Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the gleam in his eye, one that suggested not just appreciation for the antique, but a deeper, more calculated interest in its worth. "And what do you make of the teapot?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. His brow furrowed slightly, his attention still fixed on the object. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Mandarin pattern late Qing. Quite valuable. But of course its value is overshadowed by the nonsense surrounding it." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you believe it's cursed?" she asked, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet challenge. He responded quickly, almost too quickly. "Not in the supernatural sense. No," he said, his smile a little too tight. "But some stories, well, they can be dangerous in their own way." Miss Marple tilted her head, pressing further. "I was told you offered to purchase it from Beatrice," she remarked, her tone casual but laden with intent. He shrugged nonchalantly, though his eyes betrayed him, flicking with a touch of impatience. "A modest offer," he admitted. "She refused, of course. Said it belonged in the house. Family heirloom and all that." But Miss Marple saw beyond the surface. "And yet you continued to press the matter?" she inquired, her voice soft but incisive. He gave a grin, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been known to be persistent," he said, his gaze hardening just slightly. Miss Marple knew better than to trust that grin. It was the smile of someone used to getting their way, no matter the cost. While he might not have believed in curses, his obsession with acquiring the teapot made it clear that he valued something far more dangerous: its price. Miss Marple spent the rest of the evening taking quiet stock of the house, not the furnishings or the antiques, but the subtle changes in behavior she had begun to notice. Hesitations in speech, nervous glances, the things people didn't say when they thought no one was listening. She spoke with Clara later, noting how the young woman flinched at the smallest raised voices, her demeanor fragile, her eyes filled with something deeper than grief. By contrast, Nigel Langford kept himself occupied with letters and legal matters, consulting with too much enthusiasm, as though eager to distract himself from something far more troubling. Miss Marple observed all of this closely. She knew the truth was never as simple as it seemed, and soon enough, it would all fall into place. There were stories here, stories that had yet to be told, but Miss Marple was certain they were about to be uncovered, hidden beneath layers of deception and fear, waiting to be exposed. Molly was unusually evasive, avoiding prolonged conversation with Miss Marple, as if each question she posed was a delicate thread that threatened to unravel his composure. Charles Merton, on the other hand, hovered near the glass-fronted cabinet, his fingers brushing against its lock in a manner too careful, too intentional. Martha moved silently through the corridors, her footsteps light and cautious, as if she feared even the shadows could betray her. It was, in essence, exactly the kind of household Miss Marple had encountered many times before. A place where tension simmered beneath a veneer of politeness, where every gesture and every word was carefully measured. Yet the truth was hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. She asked casual questions, questions designed to glean information without arousing suspicion. When had Beatrice last changed her will? Had Clara and Nigel ever entertained guests? How frequently did the doctor visit? The answers came easily enough, but it was in the manner of delivery that Miss Marple found her clues. Nigel uncharacteristically stammered over the mention of the will. Clara glanced nervously at her husband before answering. And Dr. Moley offered vague responses that didn't quite match the details Martha had provided. No one lied outright. But Miss Marple knew well that truth often speaks most clearly, not in what is said, but in who looks away when it's being spoken. Slowly, piece by piece, the picture began to emerge, a tapestry woven from whispers and half-truths, each thread linking together in a pattern she was just beginning to understand. It was well past tea time when Miss Marple found herself in the drawing room, ostensibly searching for her forgotten knitting basket. The fire crackled warmly, casting a golden glow across the room, but her eyes were drawn to Nigel Langford, who knelt by the hearth, tossing something into the flames. His eyes met hers in surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice too bright, just clearing out some of Aunt Beatrice's clutter. Miss Marple's smile was warm but knowing. "Paperwork has a way of accumulating, doesn't it?" she remarked casually. "What were they, if I may ask?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing of importance. Just old bills, insurance forms. No need for them now." He gestured toward a stack of yellowing envelopes at his feet, already partially singed. He made to toss the last of them into the fire, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "I do hope there's nothing official among them," she said lightly. "The vicar once burned a perfectly good lease by mistake, and it caused no end of trouble with the parish committee." Nigel laughed, perhaps too quickly. "Oh, no fear of that. I've checked them all." Miss Marple watched as the paper curled and blackened in the fire, her thoughts racing. It wasn't the old bills that intrigued her, but the speed with which he had disposed of them, as though certain documents were better gone before anyone had the inclination to read them. The next morning, Miss Marple wandered into the study, only to find Charles Merton hunched over the glass cabinet, his attention focused intently on the lock of the teapot display. As soon as he heard her footsteps, he straightened, but Miss Marple caught the guilty flicker in his eyes. "Mr. Merton," she said pleasantly, her voice smooth as she stepped into the room. "I hope I'm not intruding." He cleared his throat, putting on an air of nonchalance. "Not at all, Miss Marple. I was just admiring the collection." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that didn't escape her notice. "Indeed fascinating," she said, stepping closer. "I understand Mrs. Langford was quite the connoisseur of Oriental porcelain." Charles seemed to relax, adopting a scholarly air. "Yes, some of these pieces are rather rare, though not all are authentic. That teapot, however, quite unique." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "I understand you once expressed an interest in acquiring it," she remarked. His smile was sheepish. "Guilty as charged," he admitted, a little too quickly. "I'm always on the lookout for curiosities with an unusual history." Miss Marple moved a little closer, her gaze falling on the lock of the cabinet. A thin scratch marred its surface, but it remained locked. "Ah yes," she said thoughtfully, "but it seems someone has had access to it more recently." His voice trailed off as he busied himself with a dusty book on the shelf. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the lock, slightly ajar, the telltale signs of recent tampering clear. Whoever had opened it, they had done so in secret, and secrets, in Miss Marple's experience, rarely stayed hidden for long. Later that day, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Moley on the front steps, preparing to leave in his motorcar. His attention was focused elsewhere, his eyes darting toward the driveway rather than meeting hers. "Doctor," she said gently, her voice soft, yet carrying a quiet weight, "might I have a moment of your time?" The doctor's response was delayed, as though he were distracted by something just out of sight. Finally, he turned, offering her a thin smile. "Of course, Miss Marple, but I really must be going. Urgent matters." His words were polite, but his demeanor was rushed, like a man trying to flee without showing his cards. Yet, Miss Marple knew all too well, it was never the urgent matters that were truly pressing. It was always what lay beneath the surface. Miss Marple stood in the quiet hallway, the sound of footsteps echoing faintly behind her, her keen eyes missing nothing. As she wandered from room to room, the house felt colder, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The Langford estate, with its grand tapestries and polished wood, was a picture of restraint. Yet beneath the surface, a tangled web of secrets simmered. Charles Merton, whose manner was often too hurried for comfort, was found again hovering by the locked cabinet, his fingers brushing over its surface with an almost obsessive care. The teapot, so meticulously kept, seemed to draw him in like a magnet, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flickered nervously when their gazes met. Admiring the collection. "Are you Mr. Merton?" she asked, her voice light yet tinged with an unspoken challenge. He shifted awkwardly, mumbling about the rarity of the pieces, but his words didn't quite align with the quick, sharp movements of his hands. She could almost hear the unspoken thoughts that danced behind his eyes, thoughts that he wasn't ready to share. Later she observed Dr. Moley, whose vague answers to her questions about the time of Beatrice's death only deepened the suspicion she'd begun to form. His hurried departure, the way he avoided her gaze, every gesture seemed to speak volumes. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the image they formed was still a mystery. When Clara, trembling and pale, brought Miss Marple a crumpled note she'd found tucked away in Beatrice's desk, the final thread of doubt began to unravel. The note, written in Beatrice's unmistakable hand, spoke of a warning. Charles Merton had been pressing her to sell the teapot. It was no longer about just a teapot, but about what it represented: secrets, lies, and perhaps murder. Miss Marple's mind raced as she unfolded the note once, then twice, her thoughts sharpening with each passing moment. The timing was too convenient, the clue too obvious, and the more she thought about it, the more it felt staged. It was almost as if someone had set it all up to be discovered. Too neatly, too carefully. And then there was Martha Pike, whose hesitance to speak about what she'd seen the night of Beatrice's death spoke volumes. "A woman," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible, but Miss Marple heard the weight of her words. "A woman with her hair tied back. Not Nigel, not Dr. Moley, but Clara." Clara was the one closest to Beatrice that night. Miss Marple didn't need to hear more. She could already see it unfolding in front of her, the tightly wound threads of fear, greed and desperation. In the drawing room, Clara's hands trembled as she poured tea, her fingers brushing against the delicate china, as though it might shatter under the pressure. Nigel's jaw was set, his eyes dark with a tension that hadn't been there before. And Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface of every polite word and every perfectly posed gesture, there was a deeper truth, one that was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected of ways. Miss Marple paused, her gaze flickering across the room, the delicate silence pressing down upon her. Not all silence, she knew, was born from guilt. Sometimes it came from fear, a fear that clouded the mind, making it impossible to speak. She observed Charles Merton again, his hands jittery, as he adjusted his glasses, and once again turned his attention to the teapot, drawing all eyes toward it. His voice, once so smooth, faltered as he examined the crack in the porcelain spout. "Odd," he muttered, pointing it out with an air of concern, though Miss Marple noticed the slight edge of anticipation in his movements. "This wasn't here before. A fine crack, almost invisible, unless you're looking for it." His eyes narrowed suspiciously, but the tone of his voice was calm, too calm. "Are you sure?" Miss Marple's voice, soft but probing, carried an undercurrent of suspicion. "Absolutely," he insisted, as if his assertion might make it true. His attempt at distraction was too obvious, and she felt the puzzle pieces falling into place. It wasn't the crack that mattered, but what might have been concealed within it. She shifted her gaze to Dr. Moley, her mind running through possibilities. "Do you think Digitalis would leave a taste behind, Doctor?" she asked, as if testing the waters. The doctor stiffened, his lips thinning. He did not respond, but his hesitation spoke volumes. "So it would be undetectable then, in a cup of tea." Miss Marple's thoughts spun, tracing the ritual of nightly tea and medicine, the routines people followed without thought. She recalled a case long ago, a widow poisoned not by tea, but by sugar, her niece dosing the sugar bowl with strychnine, knowing that the old woman would take 2 lumps, and yet no one thought to test the sugar. The truth had been hidden in plain sight. Now Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her thoughts returning to Beatrice, and her obsession with the teapot. It was too neat, too perfect, the way everyone had focused on it, as if the teapot were the answer. But what if it had been a distraction, a clever piece of misdirection, designed to lead them all down the wrong path? Her eyes flicked to the chipped teaspoon, the one that didn't quite match the set. Beatrice had been meticulous, always taking her medicine before bed, always using the same spoon for her tea. What if it had been the spoon that delivered the fatal dose? Miss Marple sat back in her chair, lost in thought. The more she pondered, the clearer the picture became. Not supernatural forces or mythical curses, but simple cold motives. The ashes from Nigel's burn pile still smoldered in the fireplace, the remnants of something buried, something sinister. The truth was not in the porcelain, or the legends, but in the human desire for control, for power, for something more than what they were willing to admit. That morning, in the garden, Clara had seemed more composed than usual, her hands shaking as she arranged flowers. Miss Marple had watched her closely, noting the way Clara's sleeve shifted as she brushed it down with too much care, revealing a faint bruise beneath her skin. "Clara," Miss Marple began gently, "might I trouble you to help me with the garden plans later? The roses seem to need a firmer hand than I have." Clara gave a fleeting smile, her eyes downcast, but the movement had been too calculated. Miss Marple had learned long ago how to read the signs, the smallest of gestures, the tightening of fingers, the way fear could weave itself into the most innocent of actions. That afternoon, in the rose garden, Miss Marple casually commented, "There are many types of silences, Clara. Some born of sorrow, some from modesty, but the silence born of fear is usually accompanied by bruises." Clara's hand trembled around her teacup, her face suddenly pale. "Sometimes," Miss Marple continued softly, "people use love as a leash, convincing us to hold their secrets, even when those secrets threaten to break us." The air seemed to still, the tension thick between them. Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple knew the truth before Clara could speak it. The fragile threads of trust had been torn, and the answers Miss Marple sought were closer than ever, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. The game was far from over, the final piece was still in motion, and soon the truth would be too powerful to deny. Clara's voice trembled as she hesitated, caught between guilt and fear, her confession unfurling like a reluctant whisper into the stillness of the room. She had been forced into complicity, not out of malice, but out of a crushing weight of fear. Fear of Nigel, a man she knew had a darkness lurking beneath his charming exterior. "It was him," she murmured, barely audible. "He told me to put the teapot in Beatrice's room that night. Said it would calm her down, make her think twice about her suspicions." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind swiftly connecting the dots. She leaned forward, her voice like soft velvet. "Why did you listen to him, my dear?" Clara's hands twisted nervously in her lap, the weight of the confession pressing down on her. "I thought it was harmless at first, but then I saw the bruise," she whispered, her sleeve shifting to reveal a faded mark on her wrist. The bruise, Miss Marple noted, was no accident. It spoke of control, of force. He was angry with her. You see, he wanted to stop her from changing the will. I didn't want to help him, but he made it clear there would be consequences if I didn't. Her voice broke slightly, betraying the fear that still gripped her. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place in Miss Marple's mind. A teapot, a simple object, had been weaponized, but not in the way anyone had imagined. Beatrice had always been so certain of the curse that hovered over her family, her mind clouded by superstition and dread. But what if the curse was simply a distraction? The real weapon wasn't in the teapot, but in the hands of those around her, those who had watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the kitchen, where the routine of daily life continued, unaware of the storm that was about to break. She moved to the cutlery drawer, her fingers brushing over the silver teaspoons, each one gleaming under the soft light. But one caught her attention, a spoon ever so slightly chipped on its handle. It was a small imperfection, hardly noticeable to the untrained eye, but to Miss Marple, it was a glaring sign. She remembered the first tea at Elderflower Lodge, when Beatrice had served tea with such care. It was the same spoon, the one used to deliver the fatal dose. Miss Marple examined it closely, the faint traces of powder clinging to its edge. It was only a tiny amount, but enough to make her sure. This was the tool of the murder. She turned to Clara, her voice gentle but firm. "Which spoon did you use, dear? The night you brought Beatrice her tea?" Clara's eyes widened, with a flash of panic, but she quickly lowered her gaze. "The one on the tray." Nigel had laid it out. Miss Marple's heart sank as the truth became clearer. The teapot had been the distraction, a cursed object designed to draw attention away from the real method of murder. It was the spoon, the chipped one, that had been used to deliver the poison. The plan had been meticulous, executed with a coldness that chilled Miss Marple to the core. As the evening drew on, Miss Marple's thoughts swirled, each detail coming into sharper focus. The death of Beatrice had been no accident, no natural cause. It had been a calculated move, a murder disguised as a natural death, the perfect crime hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's mind raced, connecting every thread of the mystery. And as the last piece of the puzzle locked into place, she realized the full extent of the deception. It wasn't just the curse of the teapot that had taken Beatrice's life. It was the curse of greed, of desperation, of betrayal, and it had been executed with the precision of someone who understood the dark corners of human nature far too well. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, the dim light from the fireplace casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Her fingers, delicate and precise, rested on her lap, but her mind was racing, weaving through the tangled web of deception that had ensnared Elderflower Lodge. The case had seemed simple at first. A woman found dead, an old teapot, and whispers of a curse. But as Miss Marple had learned over the years, nothing was ever quite as it seemed. Beatrice Langford, despite her rigid demeanor and stubborn nature, had become a victim, not of an ancient curse, but of her own deepest fears. Nigel Langford, her nephew, had been the architect of this tragic outcome, but he had done so with a cunning cruelty that Miss Marple could not help but admire, despite the horridness of his actions. It wasn't the teapot, she now knew, that had sealed Beatrice's fate. The teapot, with its chipped porcelain, and the shadows of past superstitions, had been a mere tool, a distraction, carefully orchestrated. The object itself had no power, no curse, but Nigel had known that his aunt's irrational fear of it was all he needed. He had played on that fear, feeding it until it consumed her completely. She had clung to that cursed object as if it were the only thing in the world that could protect her, believing that the curse would be her end. But the true poison had come not from within the pot, but from the very spoon that Clara had unwittingly used to serve the tea. The thought of Digitalis, that quiet, invisible killer, ran through Miss Marple's mind like an echo. A substance so deadly in large doses, yet so perfectly suited to slipping past the defenses of someone like Beatrice's, whose heart was already frail from years of stress and fear. It had been a stroke of twisted genius, slipping the poison into her tea, into the one thing she had relied on for comfort. But it hadn't just been the poison itself, it was the timing, the circumstances, the psychological pressure that had been expertly applied to push Beatrice over the edge. Miss Marple recalled the moments in the evening before Beatrice's death, the way Clara had described how the teapot had been placed in her aunt's room, as if by accident, as if the curse were real. But it was never about the teapot. No, it had always been about the belief that the curse had come for her, and in that belief, Beatrice had unknowingly sealed her own fate. Miss Marple's mind shifted to Clara, sitting across from her now, her hands trembling in her lap. The poor girl had been coerced, manipulated by Nigel into doing something she had never wanted. Clara had been caught in a moral quandary, forced to act under threat and fear. Miss Marple understood all too well how the mind could be twisted under pressure, how the smallest seed of doubt could be cultivated into something far darker. Clara had been the pawn in Nigel's carefully laid plan, and Miss Marple knew that she carried the weight of this tragedy on her shoulders, though she was not to blame. The true blame lay with Nigel, whose ruthlessness had made him blind to the cost of his actions. It wasn't just about the money or the estate. It was about control, about power. Nigel had feared losing his place in the family, feared being replaced by a niece whom Beatrice's had grown fond of. He had done everything in his power to ensure that the will would be revised in his favor, but when he found out about Beatrice's intentions to leave something to Clara, he had acted swiftly. The change to the will had sealed the deal in his mind. If Beatrice's had died a few days later, Clara would have inherited. But by timing it just right, he had ensured that the estate would revert to him entirely, with no one else to challenge his claim. It had been a calculated move, one made with cold precision, using Clara as a reluctant accomplice. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the kitchen, where the faint sound of Martha Pike's movements could be heard through the walls. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if the house itself were holding its breath. It was time. She had all the pieces now, the motive, the method and the opportunity. Nigel Langford had manipulated his way into everything, and now Miss Marple would make sure the truth was known. The solicitor, Mr. Hesketh, had unwittingly provided the final confirmation she needed. The new will, which had been signed just days before Beatrice's death, was the key to understanding the motive behind the crime. Beatrice's had wanted to leave a small trust to Clara, independent of her husband, but Nigel had known this and acted swiftly to ensure the timing of her death would eliminate any chance of that happening. Miss Marple knew the significance of the timing. Beatrice's had passed just when it suited Nigel the most, leaving him with everything, without any real suspicion falling on him. He had planned it all with meticulous care, weaving his actions through the veil of superstition and fear, masking his true intentions. Sitting there in the flickering shadows of Elderflower Lodge, Miss Marple could almost hear the click of the lock in her mind, the final, satisfying click that signaled the unraveling of the mystery. She had seen it all. The manipulation, the fear, the lies, the pieces fit together perfectly. And now, with the truth in her hands, she would bring the murderer to justice. The delicate silent art of observation had led her here, and she knew that justice would always find its way, no matter how carefully it was hidden behind lies and fear. Miss Marple stood still in the dimly lit drawing room, the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a thick fog. The soft crackling of the fireplace seemed to echo in the silence, but the room was alive with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. She had summoned them all here, each one with their secrets, their lies and their motives hidden beneath carefully constructed facades. The hour was neither dramatic nor full of thunderous revelations. Instead, it was the quiet before the storm. A twilight moment where truth, like a fragile bird, might either take flight or be smothered by fear. Nigel was the first to enter, his steps deliberate, his face a mask of composure. But Miss Marple noticed the slight twitch in his jaw. Clara followed, her pallor more pronounced, but her posture was rigid, as if she were trying to hold herself together in the face of something much larger than herself. Melly trailed behind them, a disapproving frown etched on his face, while Charles Merton wandered in last, his pipe clutched in his hand, though it remained unlit, as if the act of lighting it was somehow too trivial for the weight of the moment. Martha lingered by the door, her uncertainty palpable, unsure whether she was merely a witness or a part of the unfolding drama. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice soft but firm, gesturing to a seat for the maid. There was a brief pause as everyone settled, their eyes flickering between one another, some with nervous glances, others with a cold indifference. Miss Marple remained standing by the fire, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her expression serene as ever. "Thank you for joining me," she began, her voice calm but with an edge that cut through the room. "I do not often involve myself in family matters, but this, I believe, concerns us all. We all seek answers, but more than that, We seek justice." Her words hung in the air, but it was clear that Nigel was already bristling. "Is this really necessary, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled impatience. "I believe it is," she replied, her voice unwavering. "A woman has died, and we have been quick to attribute her death to myths and superstitions. But the truth, as I have come to realize, is far more deliberate, and far more human than we care to admit." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes sharp and focused. "We are not dealing with a curse," she continued, her voice steady, "but with murder. The story of the cursed teapot, which has captured the imagination of this household for far too long, is nothing more than a distraction, a tool used to divert our attention from what really happened. No object, no matter how cursed, has the power to kill. That power lies with people, and with the choices they make." A slight shift in the room, a subtle change in the air. Clara stared at her lap, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Nigel, who had been leaning back in his chair, now stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. Miss Marple let the silence stretch before continuing. "Mrs. Langford feared the teapot," she said softly. "But more than that, she feared what it represented. She had come to associate it with death, with something dark and inevitable. And in her fear, she became vulnerable. She was prey to someone who understood that fear all too well, and knew just how to exploit it." Miss Marple paced slowly, not for effect, but to gather her thoughts, to let her words sink in. "Someone placed the teapot by her bedside, not out of superstition, but to play on her terror. A trembling hand, not her own, moved the teapot into her room, setting in motion a series of events that would lead to her death. This act alone was enough to unnerve her, to convince her that the curse was real, that death had come for her." Martha gasped softly, her eyes wide with shock, and Miss Marple allowed a moment of quiet to pass before she went on. "But Mrs. Langford did not die from fear," she said, her voice quiet yet filled with certainty. "Her heart did not simply give out. It was made to fail. Someone with cold calculation used something far more precise than fear to bring about her end." She paused, drawing their attention to the small silver spoon she had placed on the table in front of her. "This," she continued, "is the spoon used to serve her tea that fateful night. A chipped, mismatched thing, coated with traces of digitalis. A poison so subtle, so insidious, that Mrs. Langford, in her fear and confusion, might never have noticed it." Dr. Melly jumped to his feet, disbelief evident in his expression. "This is absurd," he exclaimed. "You can't possibly know that without proper testing." Miss Marple smiled gently, the slightest trace of irony playing at the corners of her mouth. "Indeed, a laboratory could confirm it," she said calmly. "But the taste, if it were subtle enough, would have gone unnoticed by someone already on edge." Mrs. Langford was not just afraid of the teapot. She was afraid of everything around her, and when the poison mixed with her fear, it was enough to finish what had been started. The room fell deathly silent. Every eye was fixed on Miss Marple as the truth began to unfurl before them. "This," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "was no curse. This was murder. Cold, calculated, and entirely human." The room had settled into a tense silence, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Clara sat motionless, her hands clutching the edge of her seat, eyes wide with a mix of horror and disbelief. Nigel, for the first time, seemed utterly caught off guard, his face paling as Miss Marple's gaze fixed on him with unnerving calm. "Fear," she began, her voice soft but certain, "is a weapon, one far sharper than any blade. And it was this very fear that was used to manipulate the truth." She paced slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving her audience. "Mrs. Langford's death was not a tragic accident, nor the result of a ghostly curse. No, it was a calculated act, a methodical use of the mind's deepest vulnerabilities. A curse, yes, but not one wrought by supernatural forces. It was a curse made of flesh and blood, crafted by someone who knew her every weakness." She paused, letting the tension build, before turning her gaze to Nigel, his discomfort now palpable. You knew, didn't you? You knew her routine, her fears, her daily habits. You knew exactly how to manipulate them. Miss Marple's words sliced through the room like a blade. You had the perfect access, her medication, her routine, and that accursed teapot. But the teapot, the object of such superstition, was merely a diversion. The real poison came from something far more insidious, digitalis, hidden in the very thing she trusted most. Clara gasped, her breath catching in her throat. Miss Marple continued, undeterred. It was you, Nigel, who ensured that Beatrice would take her tea, trusting the routine she had followed for years. You knew that fear, the curse of the teapot, would make her more susceptible. You used that fear to ensure she consumed the poison without hesitation. She turned her gaze to the maid, Clara, whose eyes were brimming with guilt and fear. Clara, Miss Marple said gently, you were not the instigator, but you were complicit in this plot, coerced by someone you loved and feared in equal measure. He used you, manipulated your affection for Beatrice, and your fear of his wrath, to make you a pawn in his game. Clara's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes as she whispered, I didn't want to hurt anyone. I thought I had no choice. Miss Marple nodded, her voice filled with empathy. You were not the mastermind, Clara. You were a victim of fear, just as much as Beatrice. But now we must confront the real villain, the one who thought they could escape justice by weaving fear into the very fabric of this house. She turned back to Nigel, who had grown pale and still, unable to meet her piercing gaze. You thought you could hide behind a lie, behind a myth, behind a simple teapot, but in the end it was the truth that found you. Silence enveloped the room as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled over them, leaving no room for doubt. The truth, as always, had a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply it was buried, and now in the quiet aftermath, it was clear that justice would finally be served. Miss Marple had kept the tarnished silver spoon hidden away throughout the earlier exchange, the small object almost unnoticed in the folds of her pocket. But now, as the tension in the room reached its peak, she placed it delicately on the table before them. It gleamed faintly in the dim light, its chipped handle a subtle yet telling imperfection. A simple piece of silverware, it seemed, yet it was the very key to unlocking the mystery of Beatrice's death. This, Miss Marple said quietly, her eyes scanning the room, is the spoon used to stir Beatrice's tea that fateful night. It was taken from the tea tray after her death, and it's crucial to understanding what really happened. She allowed the silence to deepen as she continued, her voice steady and measured. You see, this spoon was not part of the set when I last examined it. There's a small flaw in the handle, a crack that wasn't there before. And that flaw, Mr. Langford, she turned her gaze toward him, was the mistake that betrayed you. Nigel's face paled, his lips thinning as the weight of her words sank in. He had assumed the imperfection would go unnoticed, believing that a small flaw in a piece of silverware wouldn't raise suspicion. After all, it was easy enough to dismiss as nothing more than a defect. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled by such a careless oversight. The tiniest misstep, the smallest detail, had been enough to unravel the whole deception. The teapot, the so-called curse, was never the instrument of death, she explained. It had been a carefully crafted distraction, a red herring meant to cloud judgment and draw attention away from the real weapon. The poison hidden in the teacup slipped in under the guise of routine. The digitalis, expertly administered over time, had done its work in a way that no one would think to question. As Miss Marple's eyes swept the room, her voice grew softer, almost sympathetic. The curse was an illusion, a story designed to manipulate fear. But it was the greed in your heart, Mr. Langford, that drove you to murder. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The inheritance, the will, the fear of losing it all. When Beatrice changed her mind about the legacy she planned to leave, you couldn't bear the thought of losing your wealth and position, and so you decided to act. Clara, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, looked to Miss Marple for clarity. But what about the teapot? If it wasn't part of the plan, why was it left in her room? She asked, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's response was simple. The teapot was the distraction. A symbol of the curse, something to keep the suspicion away from the real motive. The poison, however, was in the routine, in the trust that Beatrice had in the hands of the person who cared for her. The room fell into an uneasy stillness, as Miss Marple turned her focus back to Nigel, whose defiant posture had crumbled into something resembling fear. He had underestimated the keen eye of the investigator. He had thought that the elaborate ruse, built on superstition and manipulation, would protect him. The curse was never real, Miss Marple said softly, her voice unshaken. The only curse here was the one you carried in your heart. The constables entered quietly, their footsteps echoing through the tense silence. With a final resigned sneer, Nigel Langford was escorted from the room, his hands bound by the cold weight of his crime. As he passed Miss Marple, he muttered bitterly, a spoon was all it took to catch me." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, her answer deliberate and unflinching. "No, Mr. Langford, it wasn't the spoon. It was your actions that sealed your fate. The spoon was merely the final piece of the puzzle." As the door closed behind him, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. The game had been played, and the truth had come to light. Clara, who had remained stoic through the ordeal, now collapsed into her chair, her composure shattering like glass. Her hands flew to her face, tears streaming down as the weight of the truth washed over her. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the relief that had been so long denied to her. And Miss Marple, watching this transformation, gave a small knowing smile. It had all been a game of details, of watching, waiting, and understanding the truth hidden beneath the surface. The case was closed. Miss Marple sat quietly, her eyes tracing the movement of the rain outside her window, the soft patter against the glass a gentle rhythm that filled the room with a sense of calm. Her cup of tea sat untouched, its warmth now forgotten, as her mind sifted through the events of the past week. The truth had been uncovered, the tangled web of deceit unraveled with such precision that it almost felt anticlimactic. But not to Clara. Clara had been a victim, manipulated by the very person she trusted most. And now, as she sat by Miss Marple's side, her tears had long dried, replaced by a quiet, measured relief. "I never meant for it to go this far," Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced at the woman who had seen through it all. Miss Marple, ever calm, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were blinded by fear, dear. But in the end you found the courage to see beyond it." Clara nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had carried in silence for so long. The teapot, the one that had been the catalyst for so many lies, had been nothing more than a pawn in a game of manipulation. Its legend had loomed over the Langford household for years, a tale of doom and death woven with superstition and greed. Yet it had been the hands of those who sought to control, to bend others to their will, that had made the story real. It wasn't the teapot that held the power, it was the hearts of the men and women who believed in its curse, who let it shape their actions. Miss Marple stood up, her gaze shifting to the corner where the teapot now sat, a relic of a past that had long since been buried. It was no longer the object of terror, but a symbol of human frailty and ambition. The museum curator, Mr. Avery, had taken it without a second thought, brushing it aside, as another curiosity to be tucked away in a dusty shelf, another forgotten artifact of a bygone era. Miss Marple knew better. The teapot's curse had been broken, but the true curse, the one that had driven Nigel Langford to murder, still lingered in the hearts of those like him. His greed, his desperate need to secure his inheritance at any cost, had driven him to kill. And in the end it had been a single, seemingly insignificant detail, a chipped spoon, that had shattered his carefully constructed web of lies. The spoon, that small overlooked flaw, had been the key to his undoing. His arrogance had blinded him, and he had underestimated the sharpness of Miss Marple's mind. "You see, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, her voice breaking the silence between them, "it's never the object that holds the power, it's the people, and the choices they make." Clara looked at her with a mix of awe and gratitude. the weight of her words sinking in. "I was so sure the curse was real," she murmured. "But you knew all along, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with quiet satisfaction. "Sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones we create in our own minds. But the truth, Clara, is much simpler. It was greed that killed your aunt, not a curse." The finality of those words seemed to lift a burden from Clara's shoulders, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe freely, her heart unburdened. As the days passed, the teapot was placed in the local museum, a mere trinket now, stripped of its legend, its power, and its place in the dark corners of the Langford family's history. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair, a new pot of tea brewing in front of her, the warmth of the cup a small comfort, as she settled into the familiar rhythm of life. Mrs. Hartley, the vicar's wife, had come to visit, and the two women shared a peaceful silence, the quiet ticking of the clock, the only sound between them. "You've seen so much, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hartley said, breaking the silence with a soft sigh. "But tell me, what do you think was really behind it all? Was it the curse? Superstition?" Miss Marple paused, her eyes reflecting a deep wisdom that came with years of quiet observation. "Superstition can be powerful, my dear, but it is not the root of evil. Fear, pride, and above all, greed, they are the true culprits. People will always be tempted by their own desires, and it is those desires that lead them astray." She took a slow sip of her tea, her voice growing quieter with each word. "It was never the teapot, you see. It was never about the object. It was always about the person, the one who sought to control, to manipulate others for their own gain." Mrs. Hartley nodded slowly, as if she were seeing the truth for the first time, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fall away. They sat in silence again, the warmth of the room surrounding them, the soft hum of life continuing on as it always had, untouched by the darkness that had briefly entered their world. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, sipped her tea with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the truth had been revealed, and the evil that had once held sway over the Langford family was now but a distant memory. As Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her cottage, her mind returned to the case that had consumed so much of her recent days. The teapot, so long feared and believed to be cursed, had now become nothing more than a relic, its supposed power shattered, and its dark legend fading into the past. But as she reflected, her gaze fixed on the warmth of the fire crackling softly in the hearth, she knew that the real curse had never resided in the porcelain, nor in the superstition that had clouded the minds of the Langford family. No, the curse lay deeper, in the hearts of the people who had chosen to wield it, to manipulate fear, and to deceive in the name of greed and power. It was always the darkness within the human soul that proved to be the most dangerous, the most insidious. The teapot had simply been a tool, a means to an end, a teaspoon, an ancient fear passed down through generations, and a carefully orchestrated ruse had all come together in a web of betrayal, driven by the desperate, crippling fear of losing control. And yet, despite all the sinister plots that had been set in motion, it was Miss Marple's unshakable composure and sharp mind that unraveled the truth, piece by piece. As she had so often done before, she had seen through the layers of deceit to expose the real motive behind it all. Not the object, but the people who sought to use it. The curse was never in the teapot. It had always been in the hearts of those who chose to exploit others. As the teapot was carefully placed in the museum, its sinister legend a thing of the past, the lessons of the case seemed to linger in the air. Power, true power, was never held by objects. It was wielded by those who controlled them, who manipulated the fears and desires of others to further their own ends. But what if you had been in Clara's shoes? What if you had been cornered by fear, your choices limited by the influence of someone like Nigel Langford? Could you have stood firm against his pressure, or would the weight of his manipulation have sent you down the same dark path? As the story unfolded, Miss Marple's calm, methodical investigation had peeled away the layers of human weakness to reveal the ugly truth. Greed, fear, and betrayal had driven the course of events, but it was the strength of character, the courage to face those truths that ultimately triumphed. The teapot's curse, once so feared, had been broken, and its power was now nothing but a shadow, an echo of the past. And as the quiet, steady ticking of the clock filled the room, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling with the knowledge that the true puzzle had always been not the objects themselves, but the people who shaped their meaning. She smiled softly as the last of the questions in her mind faded, replaced by the calm certainty that she had once again unraveled the truth. The case was closed, but the lesson remained. Never underestimate the power of the human heart. Whether it be driven by good or evil, it is always the heart that guides the outcome.